I've got this saddle laying on my bench on its side to show you how we hold up the skirts. If you don't put something in here to hold the skirts up, they will get real floppy and have no control. So we put a piece of what I call a pocket here, and it's shaped about like this, and it's sewed to the skirt and then pulled over and nailed into the tree, and it keeps the skirts from being so floppy. Now I have it sewed, the front one, so I'm going to show you about it. I like to come out all 3/4 to half to 3/4 in front of the tree, and I'll stitch it right along here. This, we're using part of the rigging. It comes cut full enough that it comes out over past the tree, and we can sew the skirt up with it. I used to do the same thing on the back rigging, but if something happens back there, and which most of the time when you have problems with the skirt not holding up because of the deterioration of the whatever's holding the skirt up, then you have to replace the whole rigging. So I started using a separate pocket back there. You don't have near as much trouble up here. I start at the what would be the bottom, because this is where most of your pulling will come from. So I start there and have a continuous loop in my thread here, and it's tied off up in here, and that way the stress, which is along here, won't be pulling on the knot or where we tie the thread off, and it will hold a little bit better. I take about 1/2 inch stitches, and I'm using a heavy wax thread, and of course I'm coming through the wool skin, and I usually don't have that much trouble coming through the wool skin with a wax thread. If it balls up on you, just kind of work it back and forth till it turns loose and pull it on through. Also, if you'll notice, you don't see any raw edge along this line right here. I bevel it, and it just ends up making a neater looking saddle. If the seat jockey gets pulled up or something, well, it doesn't. You're not looking at a big old raw edge there. So I just think it looks a little bit nicer if you do it this way. I try to take a little pride in the inside of my saddle as well as the outside, because sometime or another somebody's going to have to look in it, and it just, I know when I start working on a saddle, pulling it apart, it's nice. If it's looks a little like somebody's took pride in putting it together. Now you can see how this is stitched along here, the pocket stitched back here, keeps this from flopping and this flopping. Years ago, early 1900s even, most of the time there'd be a piece of latigo string went down through the skirt and back up about 3/4, the holes would be about 3/4 inches apart, one down here and one up here, and the strings would come up and they would tack the strings, and that's how they would hold those up. And they do the same thing, have about 3 sets back here, and that's fine, that worked good. In fact, some of the saddle makers now are starting to do that back again, and I think it's because probably people going back and making the older style saddles, and so they're getting back into that. There's nothing wrong with it. It holds up just as good as this does. I'm attempting to show you the shape of the front of the ground seat. It's not getting a very good picture of this. Basically what you want to do is skive down here to almost the thickness of your stirrup leathers, and then bring it up, and you can then build up here as much as you need, but try to get it fairly thin right in here so that it won't have a tendency to spread your legs out when you swing your legs forward. As I've mentioned, this is going to be a cutting saddle, and they want some height right here. I have bowed the seat iron as much as I could when I put it in, and then I built up here almost 3/4 of an inch above the seat iron, and it's rounded. You want to get a smooth round, kind of flat coming up here, and then rounding it over depending on the height that you want here. But then you blend it out back here. Now the distance from this surface right here down to the bar of the tree is going to be about the same as it will be back here under your leg when you're just sitting still. So it's a thing that you have to work at. I don't care how long you build saddles. People's ideas change, and so you have to change with their ideas. Sometimes you'll run into a person that wants, especially cutters, they'll want their legs held out so they won't have a tendency to get their feet too close to the horse. And some people will want it just as close here as you can possibly get it, so their legs won't be sticking out, so they can hold them down to the side of the horse a lot easier. That's the reason for custom saddles. If everybody liked the same thing, then the factories could stamp them out and run them through and all the same, and everybody'd be happy. But everybody's not the same. Most, not all, but some of your customers that want to have a saddle made just for them will have special needs, a special way they want the seat, or some other part of the saddle they want it special just for them. So that's good. That's what kept the custom boot business in business for years and years and years, is people could not go in the store and buy something that would fit their feet or that they like, so they go to the custom side of the bootmaker. And that's the way it is with custom saddles. Well, I worked at White's. There was another saddle, well, there's actually two saddle makers there. One of them was Horace, and I don't recall right now what his last name was, but he was a little bit older than myself at the time. I would say he was in his 30s. Then there was a Mr. Myers. He was an older gentleman, and he didn't stamp, so I stamped all of his saddles. We made the trophy saddles for Madison Square Garden. I'm wanting to say it's 1957. We've got I've got a picture of Mr. Myers working on them, and then I've got a picture of Evelyn dying in the background on some of them. Mr. Myers he was an old timer, and he liked to do everything the old way. And one of the things that kind of got to me was that I would work real hard. Let me back up. I stamped the fronts back then. That's the way we always did them. We stamped the fronts before they were put on. And when he got ready to put them on, well, back then they put them on with a sugar-based glue. It was a paste, and it wasn't a contact cement. You covered the swells and the front cover, and then put it on, smoothed it down, rubbed all the excess out, and in the process he would just literally rub the stamping out of it. It just looked like, when he got through with the front covering the swells, you could there was no depth. It looked like maybe you took a pencil or something and did the decorative work on it. And that's the way they'd go out the door. Nobody told me to go back and straighten them up or anything, and nobody even thought about tooling them after they was put on. It wasn't long after that before they started doing that. After I moved, when I was working for Ryan's, they were doing that. They would stamp them after they put the swell cover on. They would stamp them, and it looks a lot better. You got some depth to your tooling. But the saddle shop was upstairs, and so was part of the boot shop. A Barone, a Mexican man, an elderly man, he is the one that did all of the fancy inlay work in the boots. He would cut all the inlays out and put them together, and then he would give them, well, maybe he sewed them. I believe he did. He would sew the tops also, and then hand them to somebody else, and they would assemble them and get them ready to put on the last. But Barone, when I was, somebody was giving me a tour of the shop, I guess, before I went to work, and we went upstairs and looked around the saddle shop, and they showed me a little bit around the boot shop, and Barone's fingers at this joint did a 90-degree turn, and they didn't straighten out like ours does. They were turned up at a 90-degree. These two fingers right here, because that's the ones that he used to press on the knives. All of the cutout work was done by hand with little knives, and he had been doing this ever since he was a child. I never did know exactly how old, but he had been doing it for a long time. And he said that they weren't that way. His hand was normal when he started, but I just thought to myself, man, and I hadn't been into leather work very long at that time, and I thought to myself, man, am I going to look like that when I'm his age? But they're not. I didn't do the type of work that he did, and but that was funny. Downstairs there was a Mr. Ford. If Louis didn't do it, everybody called him Louis. Either he or Mr. Ford took the measurements that come from the sales floor and converted them into patterns for all the pieces to be cut, and each measurement produced a different pattern. And they had boxes of files with people's names and their patterns. They kept the pattern they made a pattern for every customer, and they kept them on file. And if they ever ordered another pair of boots, they could just call them and say, hey, I need another pair of boots, and then any special instructions they wanted to give them, they could do it. And they had the patterns there, no problem. Didn't do any good to give them a boot size, because all of the measurements was already there, and so it made things a lot easier for a reorder. There was a Mr. Gonzalez, and he and at times he had a helper. I don't recall. I think it was another elderly man that had worked there and then would come back just for part-time, I think, when they needed him. But they did the bottoming, what they call bottoming, and that's the boot top and the foot was ready to put on the last, and so they took and put the last in the boot, and built up put the insole in, put the outsole in, built up the heels. The heels were built up with each layer of leather and trimmed and pegged